Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 10 of What If Naruto Was in Rosario Vampire. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 11 of it, comment down below and let me know. The like goal for this video is 200 likes. So like this video to let me know that you're interested in this series and you want the next part. Then go ahead and check out other what ifs in the channel. Before we start, please do support for more awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and also share this video with your friends. So let's start this video. Madara is in the real, one and only ancient old shinobi wasn't having much of a hard time, or at least it didn't seem that way to Naruto. His arms were crossed, and his long, spiked hair flowed down his back, with a bang covering his right eye. Sasuke, on the other hand, looked half dead. His entire left forearm was missing, and what was left had been wrapped in bandages that had turned a dull red. He was on his knees, using his only existing hand to support himself. The purple, ethereal ribs had surrounded him, much like the blue being surrounding Madara. "That's all you've got to show me." Madara sounded annoyed more than anything. How disappointing. Naruto kept running along the sand towards their location. He was behind Madara and the Uchiha didn't seem to notice his presence, so if he could just get in close enough. Sasuke spat on the sand, a red, thick and gooey liquid that was probably a combination between saliva and blood. He stood on his own 2 feet again, the ribsage gaining 2 arms, a neck and a skull as he did so. "I'm not dead yet." Naruto was much closer now, around 15 meters or so, and Madara still seemed oblivious to him. A familiar warm feeling enveloped him. He suddenly felt faster and stronger. It didn't take him long to realize that Kurama was giving him his chakra without so much as a second thought. Within no time at all, he was behind the Susanoo-covered Madara, a sphere of rotating chakra with 4 large points that resembled a shuriken spinning around it, spinning in his hand and creating a loud, screeching noise. If Madara hadn't noticed him before, he sure did now, but it wouldn't exactly matter. He was already in position. Naruto thrust his hand forwards. "You damn stupid idiots. You're telling me that you beat one of them up?" "Yeah," Naruto replied bluntly. All of them were seated in the front row of the class. Yukari had pulled up a desk and sat between Milka and him like usual, while Gin was up the front doing a nice impression of someone who needed anger management classes. "And after I specifically told you not to involve yourselves with them." "Yuhe." He tried to suppress an amused smile. "It was, like, 15 minutes after you told us to." "Gah." The werewolf threw his hands up in the air before slumping against the chalkboard and hissing in a breath through his teeth. Why did you have to go and disobey what I told you and start a fight with them?" "Actually, from what Sukune told us, they were the ones to start it." The blonde spared a glance at the human. "Oh well, yeah, I mean, kinda." It came out as more of a question rather than a statement. "You don't seem so sure of yourself." Gin pointed out flatly before sighing and letting his head roll back until it collided with the chalkboard, causing a small thud. "Kaio will probably be around here soon with some of his goons, and he's probably going to want to tear the club down." Naruto clucked his tongue. "I figured as much," he admitted. "That stuck-up jackass doesn't seem like the type to sit around and do nothing when one of his goons, as you put it, has been defeated. Whether we acted first or not probably won't matter to him." Gin snorted. "You got that right." Milka frowned. "What are we going to do then? We can't just let Kaio take the club down." "And we won't," Naruto said with an agreeing hum. "And what do you mean by that?" Kurumu asked curiously. "Do you have something in mind?" "Kinda, sorta, maybe," he muttered, and the others in the room stared at him, as if they were saying, "And what would you kinda, sorta, maybe plan B, Mr. Strategist?" The sarcasm in the imaginary voices wasn't missed by him. "You want me to say it? Alright. Screw it. Huddle around." "You too, Gin-senpai, don't just stand there and be depressing." When he'd finished explaining what was on his mind, Gin leaned back, heaved a sigh and ran a hand through his hair. "That's insane," he said bluntly, not looking overly excited about his idea. "Not only would I never do it within my lifetime, there's flaws in it, and it's way too risky." "Do you have a better idea then?" Naruto demanded, frowning at how Gin looked like he didn't even want to protect the club. "I'm all for taking suggestions. Strategy like this really isn't my thing. I'm more of an on-the-fly kind of guy." "Suggestions, huh? How about you go give Kaio an apology and beg for him not to destroy the club?" "How about that?" Gin huffed. "It's probably the only chance we have right now for the club to not be demolished." Kurumu opened her mouth like she was going to protest, but whatever words she was going to say died in her mouth when the door rolled open with a slam. All of their eyes went over to where the sound had come from to see Kaio standing there with a few of his underlings behind him. Naruto raised his hand in a wave. "Hey." Kaio smiled, but it wasn't a smile that said "I'm a nice guy." It was a smile that said "I'm imagining what your body would look like after hours of torture. I suppose that you're all ready to face the consequences of your actions." "Actions?" Sukune gave Kaio a look, and the yokai gave him a hard stare that made him pale slightly, but he went on anyway. "You mean us defending ourselves from your subordinate, right?" "Defending yourselves." Kaio made it sound like the 2 words were a duo of aliens. "You call severing Kito's limbs an act of self-defense?" Ah. Naruto dragged the attention towards himself. That was me, so there's really no reason to bring everyone else into this. Kaio managed to look somewhat satisfied by his admission, a stark contrast to what Naruto had expected. It's good that you were honest, but that isn't all that I'm here for. He didn't wait for any sort of response. Uzumaki Naruto, we have come across some evidence that concerns you and the human blood that runs through your veins. When Naruto had thought about his identity of being a human got out, he'd expected an explosion from everyone bar the people who already knew. So he was surprised when everyone in the immediate area, including the students who had been watching what was going on through the windows, simply looked at Kaio, as if he'd suddenly turned from a yokai to a big pile of mush labeled stupid. You're kidding, right? Yukari was the first one to break the silence. There's no way that he's human. It's just not possible for a human to do the things that he's done. I am human. Naruto thought, but kept it to himself. Yeah? Kurumu exclaimed in agreement. He beat Saizo, all those mermaids while standing on top of water, the class representative and his friends, and he defeated Ishigami just recently, too. Do you really think that a human would be able to do that on his own? What we think is irrelevant, succubus. Kaio spat, glaring at Kurumu whose confidence had apparently withered down. We're well aware of what Uzumaki has done in the past, but that alone isn't enough to negate the evidence we've come across. So sit down and keep your mouth shut. Sukune and Mocha were looking at him with worried expressions. Yukari looked indignant. Kurumu's expression was a mix between disbelief and nervousness, while Gin was grinding his teeth and looked like he couldn't decide who he wanted to send a spiteful look at. Fine. Naruto stood up and gave Kaio an easy smile. He just hoped it didn't show how much he wanted to turn the yokai into the aforementioned pile of mush. I'll let you arrest me or whatever, but in return you don't lay a hand on anyone else. We were only coming to get you, anyway. Kaio spun on his heel and made his way out, gesturing for him to follow. Mocha stood up from her chair, placed her hands on the desk in front of her, and gave him a concerned look. Make sure to be careful, alright. He gave her a small smirk in return. Mocha-chan, when am I anything but careful? As he walked out of the room, he heard Sukune snort at his statement. Kaio and the 3 other members of the Public Safety Committee that had come along were standing there. Kaio directed him in the middle, so that he was surrounded on all sides. Naruto didn't really see the point in it at first as he was going willingly, but he soon found out the reason. Any students they walked by stopped to stare and muttered among themselves, while pointing towards him. He pursed his lips. Kaio wanted everyone's attention on his prisoner, either because he wanted to show off what happened to anyone who spoke out against him, or it was just to plainly spite the blonde, maybe even both. So, do any of you guys happen to know where the closest bathroom is? I really gotta go. Sukune didn't know what to think of his day. He'd woken up early in the morning wide awake instead of having the usual sleepiness. He'd had a good breakfast, and the morning classes hadn't been bad either. But then everything had started to go downhill when it came time to start handing out the newspapers. When they began setting up their stand, he tripped and let a box of newspapers he'd been holding sprawl everywhere. Then when he'd been handing them out everyone he handed a paper to look disappointed. And of course came the part when Kaio had shown himself and almost started duking it out with Naruto in the middle of the school. After that moment, he'd been dragged off by Kurumu to continue handing out more papers, only to be interrupted by the Public Safety Committee member who was apparently called Kido. Sure, Naruto had ended up dealing with her with ease by taking her limbs off. It had still made him feel useless. Being tied and gagged by a web while your friend fought someone who'd attack you wasn't exactly something he wanted to go through again. Then after all that nonsense, Kaio had whisked Naruto away under the assumption of him being a human, which was actually a true fact. Ugh. He groaned and leaned back in his chair, wishing that he didn't feel so useless. Well, what now? Sukune glanced over at the succubus who had spoken with an uneasy expression on her face. We can't just let Kaio have his way with Naruto-kun, can we? Sukune wanted to point out how wrong her sentence sounded when phrased that way, but he held his tongue as it would be uncalled for. Sure we can. Gin said, leaning against the chalkboard with his arms crossed and an unreadable expression on his face. You heard what Kaio said, right? Naruto has human blood running through him, and with the way he phrased it, he didn't mean that Naruto was a half-breed, either. You don't actually believe that though, do you? Yukari began to protest. I mean, with all he's capable of doing and the fact that he's here in this school, it just isn't possible that he'd be human. Sukune glanced around the room. All of the students who had been watching what Kaio was doing there before had dispersed, and Mocha was fiddling with her hands and staring off into space. Other than that, the room seemed darker and colder overall, as if someone had turned the heater off and dimmed the lights. It is possible. Maybe humans have some sort of energy like our Yuki, or he could be some experiment that the humans conducted in secret. Gin pursed his lips and looked them all over. They must have had pretty incredulous looks on their faces, because Gin grunted in annoyance and pressed his back more into the chalkboard. Look, I don't know, I'm just throwing guesses out there. Even though Tsukune was pretty baffled about Gin's guess of Naruto being an experiment, he knew what he was talking about when it came to the energy that Naruto had. Chakran apparently every single human had it, if what Naruto had said was anything to go by. You sound like a conspiracy theorist, Yukari said flatly. This isn't getting us anywhere, Sukune said, straightening up in his chair. He chewed the inside of his cheek nervously. Even if Naruto is a human, which I'm not saying he is, would it really matter? He's still our friend, right? Gin didn't look like he was going to be answering anytime soon, but Yukari and Kurumu both hesitated, probably mulling over what they would think of the blonde if he turned out to be a human in their eyes. Yukari was the first one to break the small silence that had descended upon the room. She nodded, seemingly having made up her mind. Yeah, he'd still be out. She paused briefly. My friend. Everyone, Gin included, turned their attention onto the resident succubus, and she sunk in her chair at the sudden attention. Yeah, of course. Sukune nodded, satisfied, as the question applied to him too. Alright, then what are we waiting for? Let's go get him out of Kaio's grasp. Okay? Kurumu straightened in her chair, trying to put on a serious expression. It looked pretty ridiculous on her in Sukune's opinion, seeing as it was such a contrast to her usual happier seductive one. But what can we do? It's not like we can just bust into wherever their HQ is. Actually, maybe we can do exactly that. Mocha suddenly spoke up, apparently having come out of her daze. Sukune blinked at her in surprise but didn't say anything, and she continued. We can use the plan that Naruto-kun came up with earlier and get him out of there. Before anyone could voice their agreement or disagreement, Gin stood up to his full height and scowled. Now hold on a minute. He leaned forwards and planted his hands on the desk at the front of the room, looking each of them in the eyes individually, and appearing pretty intimidating as he did so. This is Kaio you're talking about, not your everyday not so friendly but weak yokai. Besides, he waved his hand in Milka's direction, gesturing to her rosary. Naruto's the only one who can take that off, right? Yes, but... Milka frowned. She looked like she was about to say more, but a sudden and very familiar voice interjected itself from the back of the room. I'm right here, you know. Sukune's head whipped around to face the blonde who was sitting in a chair at the back of the room in a leisurely fashion. He almost choked on his tongue, but he managed to get out. Wah, but weren't you just? His face must have looked pretty stupid, because Naruto gave him an amused grin. Yeah, I was, well, still am. I'm just a clone, Sukune. Oh right, Naruto could do stuff like that, the bastard. That solves that. Milka smiled at Gin, as if she just won some sort of fierce debate. Sukune idly wondered why she had been spacing out before when she seemed perfectly fine now. Wait a minute, how'd you manage to make a clone while walking with them? Sukune asked. Ah, that was easy. I or the boss, whatever, just said that he needed to go to the bathroom, and seeing as I'd gone with him willingly, it wasn't much of a problem. The clone stretched. Then I just teleported to that. He, or it, pointed upwards, and Sukune was able to make out a line of kanji on the ceiling when he squinted. You mean, you teleported to the ceiling? Yeah. And you were watching us from there? No, I dropped down into the chair about a minute ago, when I announced my arrival. The clone tilted its head to the side, apparently curious. Why? Nothing. It's just... Sukune waved a dismissive hand in its direction. Don't worry about it. Alright, well. The clone stood up. My purpose for coming here was to let all of you know that the real Naruto is perfectly fine, and there's no need to worry. Hold on. Up the front, Gin waved his hands in an all-stop manner. You're saying that you teleported. Since when could you do that? The clone blinked, but Kurumu decided to take up the task of answering in a deadpan tone. Since forever, senpai. He's always been able to do that. Well, sorry. Gin crossed his arms, looking a bit miffed. Apparently I was the only one who didn't know. That aside, Milka stood up and sauntered over to the clone. Sukune didn't know what she was feeling, but going from her expression, she seemed eager, as if she had something to prove. When she reached Naruto's clone, she placed a hand on her rosary, which had gained a red and slitted pupil, before looking him right in the eyes. Naruto-kun, can you? The blonde clucked his tongue in contemplation. Are you sure? He asked, arching a curious brow. You really want to risk yourself? She nodded resolutely, and he sighed. Alright then. He reached up, grabbed her seal, and easily took it off with a quick flick of his wrist. As soon as the soft clanking sound reached Sukune's ears, an energy that he'd become familiar with over his time at Yokai Academy exploded into existence. Yuki. Naruto sighed contentedly, shutting the swinging door to the bathroom behind him. When he brought his eyes up, he was met with an annoyed stare from Kaio, and the usual stoic ones from the other members of the Public Safety Committee. Sorry about that. He apologized half-heartedly. But I'm all done now, so let's continue with this thing. Instead of replying, Kaio simply sneered at him before resuming his old position at the front, while the others crowded around him. They set off down the hallways of the academy again. Oldest trick in the book. Naruto mused to himself, stuffing his hands in his pockets. What book? Ah, hey Kurama, you've been quiet recently. What did you expect? The Biju shot back, sounding bored. There hasn't been really anything interesting going on with your life recently. It's probably going to get interesting again real soon. He shot back, somewhat annoyed at his partner's jab at his apparently uninteresting life. I'll probably be getting into a fight with this Kyo guy soon, so you can just sit back and watch. He didn't get a reply, but he would bet the Kurama probably had his chin resting on his human-like hand, observing what was going on with his usual red and slitted eyes. They kept moving, occasionally walking by a class that was full of students that looked at them with curiosity and interest, while they ignored their annoyed teacher. Eventually, they came to a set of double doors that Kyo slammed open without pausing in his stride. Beyond the doors was a stack of stairs that presumably led to some sort of underground HQ. How original. Naruto thought as they walked down, his mind briefly flashing to Orochimaru's underground bases that had the same feeling that Kyo's gave off: dark, cold, and downright creepy. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, Naruto noticed that they were in a long, dimly lit corridor. Along the left side of the corridor were doors, probably 8 in total, each with about 10 meters of brick wall separating them. On the right side near the end of the corridor, there were another 4 doors, with the same amount of space separating as the others. They took the 5th door on the left. Instead of brick walls, there was iron bars going horizontally and vertically, with small perfectly square rooms behind them. In the small rooms were various yokai, some were in a sitting fetal position muttering to themselves, others were pacing, and some were even thrashing at the bars with wild and panicked eyes. Magnificent, isn't it? Kyo gloated, gesturing to the row of cells on either side of them with his arms. There was smugness, satisfaction, a sense of completion, and glee in his tone, a weird combination in Naruto's opinion, but he went with it. Sure, I mean, if you're into stuff like that, Naruto muttered. What? Nothing, don't worry about it. He waved his hand at Kyo, who had turned his head around to glance at him. Let's just keep walking. As they walked, some of the bolder prisoners were shouting out things in a somewhat crazed manner, like, let us out of here. All I did was badmouth the committee a little. One shouted, baring his teeth and showing off his elongated canines that reached over his bottom lip. Come on. We won't do anything against you guys again. It wasn't much longer on their journey before one of the prisoners lashed out directly at Kyo. The yokai's arm bulged and reached through the bars, becoming more and more grotesque, until it was what could only be described as a deformed claw. He took a swipe at the back of Kyo's head, right in between Naruto's body. Let us out of here, Kyo. As if he'd done it millions of times before, Kyo swiftly placed his hand on the offending yokai's chest, and his body suddenly combusted into bright, hot flames. The smell of burning flesh reached Naruto's nose almost instantly, and the claw that had been in motion stopped in his tracks. You pathetic low-class yokai. Kyo sneered, a hint of satisfaction and glee slithering its way into his voice. What were you planning to do? You never had a chance of even touching me in the first place. Naruto wasn't a fan of watching people burn, but even he couldn't draw his eyes away from the sight of the yokai writhing around and letting out short screams of pain, as he did a nice impression of a yokai Olympic torch. It was actually kind of interesting, in that same kind of way when he'd seen the first 3 Saw movies on the plane. He knew it should be disturbing and gut-wrenching, but he couldn't find it in him to look away. The flames died down, and Naruto shook his head. I really need to find a hobby. To add insult to injury, Kyo planted his foot through the iron bars and slammed it down onto the downed yokai's skull. Oh no, you won't be going anywhere. You have turned against this academy, and as such, we of the Public Safety Committee are the ones who dish out your punishment, and we're not going to be letting any one of you out anytime soon. The yokai let out a strangled gurgle that sounded like horrible. Or maybe it was more of a gulp. Kyo removed his foot and planted it on the ground outside of the cell before turning to Naruto. Now that the nuisance is dealt with, how about showing us your true form? Just like this pathetic being here. Mocha was indecisive. She didn't know whether she wanted to throw Naruto's clone through some walls, or simply kick him right where it hurt most. She'd heard that males tended to squeal when that happened. What? Mocha demanded, crossing her arms. It came out harsher than she'd intended, but went along with it, and didn't bother to correct herself. The clone leaned forwards and raised its eyebrows. What do you mean what? You were just listening, weren't you? Mocha repressed the urge to twitch at the way it made it sound like she'd been eavesdropping on a private conversation. Yes, I was, but why should I bother helping? I thought that your creator was able to take care of himself. It agreed, seemingly taking her words as if she was praising the real Naruto. He is, but does the other Mocha-chan have a different name? Amate, apparently. Right? Anyway, as I was saying, Amate, can I just say how weird this entire two-personality thing is? She scowled, and it continued. Amate made the decision of going after my creator. She seemed pretty determined, too. Mocha probably didn't look too convinced, as the clone scratched the back of its head, and gained an awkward expression. And the blood thing. If her mouth had been opened, Mocha would bet that there would probably be a trail of drool escaping it. But as it was, her mouth was closed, and her expression didn't change. She refused to be degraded into a mess just because of Naruto's blood, even if it tasted like it should be some sort of godly food. The clone's eyes gained a victorious gleam, and she forced herself to not sneer at him. Fine. I'll do it, but I expect compensation. Naruto's clone grinned, apparently satisfied with her decision. Got it. Its grin widened slightly, losing the satisfaction and becoming more teasing. So it's only compensation now. Not an actual payment. Before she could decide on how to painfully destroy the clone, it was gone, leaving a plume of smoke in its wake that Mocha waved away with her hand. She spun on her heel, and made her way to the sliding door with as much dignity she could muster after having someone's physical copy explode in front of her. Wait a minute. Hold on. Mocha glanced to the side just in time to see Tsukune stumble out of his chair like a drunk person, using the other desks around him to keep himself stable. We're all going. No? Mocha said flatly. She must have been scowling pretty heavily, because Tsukune recoiled and averted his eyes from hers. Someone like you would only get in the way. Tsukune looked like he was going to retort, but Kuruma beat him to the punch by speaking up. What do you mean someone like him? He's too weak. Mocha pointedly ignored Gin openly leering at her, and turned her attention towards Yukari and Kuruma. You two, on the other hand, will be coming. The succubus blinked and leaned forward on her desk. Okay, sure, but why do you need us to? I can't be in more than one place at once, unlike that idiotic blonde, and I'm certainly not going to be taking the perverted werewolf. She glanced at Gin, who looked more than a little bit indignant about her remark. And Aono will only get in the way, like I said before. So the two of you are my only options, and I'm only reluctantly taking them. She could see Yukari, Kuruma and Tsukune in her direct line of sight, and Gin was in her peripherals, and they all had varying looks of annoyance and even anger to a certain degree. The silence that had descended upon them lasted for a full 2 seconds before Yukari stood from her desk, the chair she'd been seated at sliding back along the floor as she did so. Her expression had become defiant, but Mocha didn't care. So long as the girl cooperated without complaint, then it was all good. Let's get going, then, Yukari said. We've got an annoyance to pick up. Naruto grimaced, the image of a murderous-looking and unsealed Mocha entering his head as his clone had apparently dispersed itself. That wasn't a good thing, and neither was the situation he was in. In front of him, Kaio was standing and giving him a glare that could probably make a baby bawl its eyes out. Well, the head of the Public Safety Committee demanded. Are you going to transform or not? Naruto's attention snapped back towards the yokai, and he smiled sheepishly, idly scratching the back of his head. Yeah, sorry. He said without bothering to put any sincerity into it. It just takes a lot of concentration for me to transform, okay? I'm not very good at it. Really? Kaio sounded and looked perplexed, as if just the idea of him transforming into his true form being difficult was out of the world. It's supposed to be more difficult transforming into a human form, not the other way around. Yeah, well, I'm different, I guess. He crossed his arms and leaned against the iron bars of one of the cells. There wasn't any ill intent coming from the prisoners directed at him, so he was confident they wouldn't touch him. Why do you think I'm always fighting looking like this? He gestured to himself. It's because it takes time. Sheesh, you think that people would use their brains once in a while. Ignoring the sneer that Kaio delivered him with an extra slice of seething eyes at the not-so-subtle insult he'd given the yokai, Naruto closed his eyes and mused over his situation, hoping that he looked like he was concentrating. Apparently Mocha had decided to start some sort of rescue mission, which was fine seeing as he hadn't been captured by Fairy Tail, and it wasn't like she was a baby, so she could make her own decisions. Then the other Mocha had gotten involved, and going by her not-so-happy expression he'd received from his clone's memories, he was going to have a very stiff neck later. Other than that, he had to fool everyone in the immediate area into thinking that he wasn't human, which sounded much easier than it actually was. It wasn't like he had any transformation that would really make him look even remotely similar to a yokai either. Sure, he had senjutsu which changed the color of his eyes, but that was it. Kaio probably wouldn't be very convinced, and neither would the others around. He debated on using Kurama's chakra, but threw the idea into the trash can labeled stupid ideas in big bold letters. Okay, admittedly, he could use just a cloak around his body, but what kind of transformation was that? He'd need to fully transform for it to be believable. Naruto could almost picture the scene, him gaining a giant fox made of chakra around him, while leveling everything around just by being there, and consequently killing everyone on accident. Great idea, Naruto. He thought sarcastically. A real ace in the hole. Before Naruto could continue his musings, Kaio's hands lit up in flames, dragging the blonde's attention towards the yokai who was sneering at him again. You're out of time, he declared, sounding more giddy than sympathetic. If it takes you so long to transform, then you don't deserve to live as a yokai, as such a disgrace. Naruto got off the wall and gave Kaio a small, excited smirk. Screw trying to think of a way to lie his way out, he wanted to fight Kaio. Oh, you can try if you really want. It sounded more cocky than it did in his head, but it didn't really matter. But I'm not just going to sit around, Kaio. Some of the prisoners edged closer to the action behind the bars with excited faces, while others shuffled away, obviously not wanting to get too close to what would soon become a battlefield. The members of the public safety committee that had escorted him got out of the way, looking confident that Kyle would win. Kyle looked downright murderous, and not in the same way Milka had. His eyes, expression, the way he was standing, and practically everything about him all but radiated bloodlust and the will to kill Naruto and anyone who decided to get in his way. Naruto would like to say he looked pretty fierce as well, but he couldn't tell, he didn't have a mirror. Before the two teens could even begin killing each other, the soft clacking of what sounded like wooden sandals reached their ears. Now, Kyle. The familiar female voice chided as the clacking sounds go louder. Even as this distraction was going on, Naruto hadn't dared to look away from Kyle, and vice versa. You promised that I would be the one to kill him. Don't get in the way, Ishigami. Kyle ordered coldly, not even sparing the woman a glance as she came into Naruto's view, standing a couple of meters behind his enemy. I'm changing our arrangement right now. You can get his charred corpse, perhaps even put it into that pathetic collection you were babbling to my subordinates about. Ishigami still had the bandana around her head, but the braided hair that she once had was nowhere to be seen, and that made Naruto smile. A charred corpse. She snarled, and Naruto idly noted that a lot of yokai tended to use that look in almost the exact same way. I don't want a corpse. The newspaper club took everything from me, my job, my honor, and my snakes. Before Ishigami could continue babbling, Naruto injected himself into the conversation, annoyed that she was getting in the way of his fight. Look, lady, the club didn't take everything from you. No one took your job, we just got you fired. What honor did you have to begin with? And finally, you could have always either sticky taped or super glued your snakes back on, they were still living. Ishigami's attention turned to him, her eyes gleaming like a snake's would when they find their prey. Don't you even start. You're the one I want to kill the most. I want to. Look, Ishigami. Naruto interrupted more forcefully. I honestly couldn't care about what you want any less, really. All I care about right now is fighting Kyle, so just get out of the way. He paused briefly. Actually, you know what? I don't care anymore. Get in the way if you want, but no one's going to pay any attention to your cold and dead body later. He lunged. Milka swung her leg, obliterating the brick wall her limb had collided with. Rubble flew everywhere, mostly landing in the room she'd busted into. The room was dimly lit, with the only light source being a bulb hanging from a chain in the middle of the room about a meter above a steel chair. Attached to the floor around the chair were chains, with each link looking as rusty and old as each other. Off to her left, there was a bench made entirely out of stone that seemed attached to the wall. On that bench was an assortment of tools: a screwdriver, a portable drill, a nail gun, a heretic's fork, a thumb screw, a tongue tear. There was even a lead sprinkler and a can of gasoline. Tools that could be used for torture and interrogation, no doubt. There was the sound of fighting ahead, fire burning, metal clanging, and what sounded like a wall crumbling. Behind her, she heard Kurumu mutter just loud enough for her and Yukari to hear. You didn't have to destroy the wall, Milka. I did. Milka replied without missing a beat, before walking through the sizable hole that was easily big enough to fit all three of them, and towards the other side of the room. Uzumaki is just up ahead, and I don't want to waste my time. The closer they got to the opposite wall, the louder the sounds of fighting got. A few meters away from the wall, Milka stopped, causing Yukari to bump into her and murmur now. Before any could ask what she was doing, there was a thump that came from the other side of the wall, followed by said wall imploding. Rubble flew towards them and landed at their feet along with the person they were searching for, looking just as surprised as they were. Naruto was in the air horizontal for only a second, before he seemed to realize what had happened, and righted himself before gravity could have a chance to slam him into the floor. His clothes were slightly singed, but that was all that Milka could make out as a potential injury. Hi, he said lamely. Yukari peeked out from behind Milka. What did you just do? Well, he scratched his head and surveyed the room, which had bricks and stone hanging around in random places. I went to land on the wall, and it kinda just broke. What the hell were you doing that made you accidentally destroy a wall by landing on it? Kurumu sounded just as flabbergasted as Milka felt. Before Naruto got to tell them why he was trying to stand on a wall, he was forced to move out of the way as a ball of fire around the size of Milka's fist was sent soaring through the broken wall. Thankfully, it missed a can of gasoline. Naruto pointed at Kaio, who had come around the corner with another ball of fire hovering just above his hand. Fighting that guy. Milka crossed her arms and gave him a dirty look. Why am I not surprised that you've already started fighting with him not even 10 minutes after you left? Naruto placed his hand over his heart with an expression of mock hurt. Oh, Milka-chan, you wound me so. You make it sound like I'm some sort of rampaging beast that only knows how to fight. You might as well be. Naruto looked like he was going to retort, but whatever was going to come out of his mouth was cut off when Kaio spoke up. Good, there's more of you here. This will save me some time. Naruto frowned and shuffled around until he was closer to standing in front of them, something that annoyed Milka greatly. What do you mean by that? He asked with a fierce expression. I thought this was just between the two of us. Oh, please. Kaio snorted and rolled his eyes as the flame that had been hovering in his hand slowly disappeared. This was never between just us two. The newspaper club was always going to get what was coming to it. That was the plan from the beginning. Naruto clucked his tongue, his frown becoming more apparent with annoyance and confusion. Then why didn't you just outright say that you thought I was a human when you visited? Thought. Kaio parroted the word. No, we never thought that you're a human, we know you are. Naruto stiffened subtly, but Milka still noticed. And how would you know something like that? Out of the corner of her eyes, Milka noticed Kuruma bite her lip while Yukari drew in a sharp breath. Well, she kind of expected something more from Naruto, all but admitting what he was in front of them, but oh well. Kaio smirked, as if he knew his next words would irritate the blonde. Why would I say something like that? That'd be just giving everything away. Naruto pursed his lips, but he didn't seem overly surprised. Fine, have it your way, I'll just beat the answers out of you. Flames seemed to rise from the ground around Kaio, swirling and coiling around him, making the air itself hotter. The gleam that Kaio had when he'd entered their view before rose in his eyes once again, and Milka would wager that if it could speak, it would be spouting its want to kill everything. She tensed and got herself ready. There was absolutely no way that she'd come all this way just to talk. She was going to take part in it, whether anyone wanted her to or not. Naruto flew through a set of hand seals, as if he'd done them thousands and thousands of times before, which he had, if he counted his usage of clones. He breathed in deeply, his cheeks puffed out, and his chest expanded more than it should be possible before he opened his mouth, leaned forward, and let his technique go. There was a faint whistling sound, while deep cuts appeared on the ground at separate intervals, each one closer to Kaio than the last. Suddenly, the flames around Kaio burned brighter, the air turned even hotter than it already was, and the fire expanded, flooding the corridor behind the fire-wielding yokai. Yukari wiped the back of hand across her forehead to clear the sweat that had gathered from immense heat. What was that? That was me, Naruto said bluntly. Why would you? She trailed off as the flames eased, simmering down to the level they'd been at previously. Naruto sighed as Kaio took a few steps towards them, looking more like he was rejuvenated, rather than burned too crisp like Naruto had hoped. That had been his plan, to see how much of his own flames Kaio could handle. Apparently it was a fair amount, oh well. Behind the head of the Public Safety Committee, small flames still burned in various places on the walls, floor, and even the rubble. Strangely enough, Kaio's uniform was still in pristine condition. Go figure. That was a stupid idea. Milka decided to supply rather bluntly. Yeah, thanks, I know that now. He murmured before glancing over his shoulder at Kuruma and Yukari. You two might want to stand back, I wouldn't want either of you to get in the way. When they didn't offer up an argument, he turned his attention back on Kaio and directed his next question to Milka. You're going to fight no matter what I say, aren't you? I didn't come all this way just to talk. Fine. Naruto felt weightless. He flew through the air, eyes half open and mouth slightly agape with blood twirling out. The last thing that came to mind was looking straight into Madara's purple, rippled eyes. Then everything was replaced by immense pain. Some of his ribs were more than likely broken, his head felt like it was constantly getting pummeled by a sledgehammer, and he might have even had a busted lung. He weakly turned his head to the side and saw that there was mass amounts of sand soaring alongside him. Before anything else could happen, a warm feeling enveloped him, and his eyes snapped open to attention, while the pain started subsiding at a rapid rate. He looked at his body and saw that he was being bathed in a golden glow Kurama's chakra. There was a snapping sound that made him wince, only to be followed by several others, and he groaned out loud. He guessed that was his ribs being set back in place and fixed. He twisted his body around just in time to land feet first on the sand, before looking around the area. A loud thump whoosh followed as the sand that had been in the air slammed back down to the ground. There was a crater right in front of him, and not a small one, either. It was like a dent in the earth, easily a kilometer wide in diameter, and was extremely deep. At the middle of the crater, a giant blue being as tall as the crater was deep was standing there, staring at him, as if it were sending silent taunts his way. Sasuke wasn't anywhere to be seen, which meant that he'd probably been blown away just like he had, but where? Naruto didn't have any time to take a look around, because Madara's Susanoo drew out one of his swords that had been resting at its left hip. It raised the ethereal blade high into the air, before bringing it down. The blade sliced through the air, causing an extremely loud whoosh. As it went, Kurama's chakra seemed to prove just as reliable as ever, as Naruto had easily been able to maneuver his body out of the way. The blade smashed into the sand, spraying the annoying and irritating substance everywhere. He balled his hand into a fist before launching it at the ethereal blade, causing it to slide along the sand away from him, with cracks forming along it all the way up to the hilt. The Susanoo's head was level with him, so it wasn't awkward when he glared straight into Madara's eyes, as he stood inside of his Susanoo's helmet-covered skull, arms crossed and looking as calm and stoic as ever. He knew the words he was about to speak probably wouldn't be very threatening, but they came with the same promise of ending the Uchiha's existence. I'm going to seal you away forever. Kaio took the first move. He drew his hand back over his shoulder, another one of his flame balls bursting into life. The yokai threw his arm forward, palm faced towards them, and the ball of fire soon turned into a stream of fire that was nearly wide enough to cover the entirety of the room, kind of like a flamethrower. Naruto and Milka reacted almost simultaneously. They turned around, grabbed one of the other two people in the room, and were out the door and into a corridor by the time the room exploded. Naruto grabbed whoever he picked up and slung over his shoulder, before putting them on their own feet, and realized he'd grabbed Kurumu. Hey. He said a little awkwardly. Kurumu didn't offer a response and just looked over in the direction of Milka and Yukari, something he was glad for. Yukari seemed to be patting as Milka put her down with an annoyed expression. The witch was probably going to open her mouth to say something, because Milka glared at her and snapped. Keep your mouth shut and leave. There was an audible click as Yukari closed her mouth. Yeah, you two better leave. Naruto agreed. Kurumu and Yukari shared a meaningful glance before the young witch spoke up. Alright, try to stay alive. He managed to keep a straight face. Thanks for the advice, he said. Yukari nodded and turned around before she began to walk away with Kurumu beside her. Before they were out of range though, Naruto had an idea. Hey wait. Kurumu stopped in her tracks first and turned to face him, her head tilted to side slightly in curiosity. What is it? A small poof of smoke later, and Naruto was holding a tri-pronged kunai. He flicked his wrist and sent it soaring, embedding it in the wall around a foot away from the succubus. Take that with you, give it to Tsukune or something. Kurumu took a glance at it, shrugged, and plucked the weapon out of the wall. Sure. She looked interested as to why, but she didn't say anything and just turned around to continue her walk with Yukari. Naruto sighed before he turned around to face Milka. That was the gas can, wasn't it? He asked, referring to the previous explosion. Yes, it was. She answered, her attention completely on the hole she'd made that they'd used as an exit. Flames spewed out of it every now and then, almost silently hissing as they burned the surroundings. Kind of surprised the walls didn't completely blow apart. Naruto mused as he eyed the cracks that had spread like a spider's web along the brick from the explosion. He didn't get any longer to think about the subject as Kaio slowly stepped through the hole looking mildly annoyed. Naruto simply couldn't resist. So we both had stupid ideas today, huh? The yokai grunted but didn't look like he was going to deny it. Regrettable ideas aside, I need to deal with the two of you so I can move on to other matters. Milka looked slightly annoyed at the idea of Kaio being able to beat her, but before she could say anything, Naruto decided to pipe up. I don't know about the dealing with us part, but a fight's perfectly fine with me. Naruto hid a grimace. That stupid sentence sounded like something someone would say when they begin a fight, not one they'd say when they were already technically fighting. I mean, yeah, let's get this over with. Kaio's yoki began to increase, and as it did the malicious intent the yokai had been emitting began growing as well. Naruto and Milka watched in silence as Kaio's entire form burst into blazing hot flames, incinerating his clothes before he bent down until he was on all fours, while his entire human structure began to shift and change. His head became a snout, his golden eyes turned into a strange red glow, his ribcage seemed to shrink in size slightly, and his back legs changed to one someone would expect to see on a dog or even a fox. The fire surrounding him seemed to flow a bit brighter, and four tails made entirely of flames sprouted out of his back, flailing around dangerously. To finish it off, Kaio opened his mouth and let out a loud bellow. Naruto's eyebrows shot up into his hairline. You have got to be kidding me. Well, would you look at that? Kurama supplied in a completely non-helpful manner. That's all you've got to say. He could almost picture Kurama rolling his eyes. What did you expect? I'm made up entirely of chakra. Well, he has yoki. It's not like I'm going to have some sort of connection to him. I kinda thought that actually. Why? Kurama sounded a little bit annoyed. Is it because I take the form of a fox while his true form is one? Yeah, a little. Damn brat. Naruto twitched, but before he could hope to continue bickering with the Biju, Milka started to explain what Kaio was with some begrudging respect in her tone. He's a Yuko, an S-class yokai such as myself. They supposedly even have the potential to become strong enough to be considered gods. She frowned. Unfortunately, this isn't going to go as quickly as I'd hoped. Keep your mouth shut and leave. Those had been words that were directed at Yukari in this situation, but Kurumu knew they were for both of them. She supposed it was just Milka's way of telling them to go and start Naruto's horrendously insane and stupid plan. Seriously, how did that guy think up a plan like that? She and Yukari walked briskly through the hallways of Yokai Academy, heading in the direction of the newspaper club's room. They were both silent on their journey as neither of them had any reason to talk. Upon reaching the room, she rolled the sliding door open and was greeted with the two people she was looking for. Gin was relaxing at the desk up the front of the room. His feet were kicked up while he twirled a pencil in his hand. Tsukune was seated in the same place he'd been in when they had left, just staring off into space with a small, self-mocking smile on his face. It was eerily silent in the club room, with just a breeze coming in through the open windows giving any life to it. Hey, Kurumu called to get their attention. It worked as well. Tsukune stopped staring at nothing and looked at her, while Gin stopped twirling his pencil and glanced in her direction. She hoped she at least had a slightly stern look on her face. She couldn't really pull them off. Stern and serious just didn't suit her. What are you doing just sitting around? We've got a plan to carry out. What plan? Tsukune asked slowly. Naruto's plan. She answered. You know, the one with the... She trailed off when she saw Tsukune's disbelieving expression. What is it? You mean, that you're actually going through with that plan? His disbelief was in his voice too. But the plan is so. He furrowed his eyebrows, probably looking for the best word that wouldn't be insulting. Ridiculous. Yeah, I know. She agreed wholeheartedly. But it's all we can do to help Naruto-kun and Mocha fight Kai right now, so get up already so we can go and put it into action. She hadn't expected Tsukune to jump up and shout out to the entire world that he was going to give the plan his all, but it was no less disappointing when he sighed and got up from his desk with an unenthusiastic expression. What do you want me to do then? Yukari was the one to explain to Tsukune his role. During it all, Gin had only spared them a few more glances, but Kurumu hadn't expected much from their president in the first place. And that's your role. Yukari finished, looking sympathetic. Tsukune was almost as pale as the dead. A bead of nervous sweat rolled down his forehead from what Yukari had just told him to do. He gulped and stood up to his full height, which was a few inches shorter than Naruto's. His expression had become one of grim determination, as if he just signed a contract that would get him killed, but would save people in the process. Kurumu wanted to tell him everything would be okay in the end, but how could she when she didn't even have confidence in that very statement? She swallowed the lump in her throat and put on a reassuring smile, deciding to give it a shot anyway. It'll be. Her voice cracked, and she couldn't get the words out. Tsukune smiled at her in thanks. Yeah, everything'll be just fine. Kaio's tail spun above him like the rotors on a helicopter, creating a set of 5 fireballs that swirled around in a circle at incredible speeds. Prepare to be burned into nothing but ashes. Kaio declared, and Naruto noticed that his voice had become deeper with a more powerful undertone. The yokai's tails reared back in preparation, the 5 balls of brightly burning flames, creating a mini fire cyclone on their own. Kaio lurched forward, followed by his tails and then his attack. Fire really was Naruto's worst enemy. He couldn't counter it with any of his techniques. He hadn't even used a Materasu once, where he'd need to suppress the flames, lest he burn everything and everyone in the area, so there was no chance for him overpowering it. So, all that was left for him to do was either dodge or defend. He chose to dodge at the last second by leaping to his right and rolling along the cold floor once he'd landed. There was an explosion behind him, followed by the sound of bricks slamming into various other objects. He glanced behind him and noticed that the wall he and Mocha had been standing in front of was all but obliterated with flames licking at the edges of the big hole that had been left. Past that hole he could see what he presumed was dirt. He couldn't really make it out from the distance and the dim lights. He squinted to see through the flames better, and could just barely make out the form of Mocha standing back on her own 2 feet at the other side of the corridor. Apparently, she decided to move out of the way as well. Mocha apparently didn't feel like standing around, though as her form briefly blurred out of his sights, before he found her a couple of feet in front of Kaio in a semi-crouch, her leg behind her, and ready to send the Yuko on a one-way trip to the other side of the HQ. It seemed that Kaio had been ready for her though, and going by his bare teeth, he didn't appreciate the gesture. He leaped backwards, jumping into the room that had previously exploded because of a gas can, dodging Mocha's limb by a hairline, and letting it destroy the wall even further. Their eyes locked briefly, and Mocha inclined her head slightly in the direction of Kaio as if to say, "You just going to stay there all day?" Ha, so it wasn't beneath her to accept help in a fight. What an eye-opener. Time to join in on the fun then. He mused aloud to himself before running back into the room that had exploded beforehand, and also the one that Kaio and Mocha were inside of. The walls, floor and the high ceiling were all charred into a dark gray bordering on black. The steel chair in the middle of the room looked disfigured, but still in the same place, probably because it was bolted into the ground. The stone bench off to his left with all the tools on it had taken quite a beating, if the fact that it looked nothing more than a large rock was anything to go by. The tools themselves were scattered around it, looking bent, out of shape, and no longer usable. Naruto blinked a few times. Wow, you really did a number on this poor place. Kaio was standing on all fours at the opposite side of him and Mocha, still looking like he wanted nothing more than to burn them into nothing but ashes. He beat his tails together above him, and another round of 5 fireballs appeared, spinning around like a mini cyclone. Unfortunately for you, you wouldn't be seeing it ever again after today. Naruto took a few steps in Kaio's direction. He supposed if Kaio had transformed and decided to take them seriously, then he could take it up a few notches as well. No, I guess I won't, but that's only because I don't want to come back down into this stank place. He turned his head around to glance at Mocha. Hope you don't mind that I'll be taking the spotlight for a bit. She studied him, her piercing crimson eyes looking straight into his very being before she nodded subtly. Sure. Much like before, Kaio lurched forwards, his tails followed, and the 5 spinning fireballs were sent roaring at Naruto and the vampire behind him. Just before impact, Naruto felt a familiar stinging sensation behind his eyes. With rough directions on a pseudo-map given to him by Yukari who had scribbled it up, Sukune navigated the corridors of Yokai Academy in order to instigate his role of Naruto's plan. Well, to be perfectly honest, it wasn't really simply Naruto's plan anymore, seeing as Yukari had tweaked it, changing it from crazy and ridiculous to just plain crazy. If he was to be honest with himself, he would rather someone else take his place and do what he was about to do, but he knew that wouldn't be possible. Kurumu and Yukari had their own things to do, and he doubted Gin would want to take any part in it. He glanced down at the poorly drawn map, just barely understanding where to go. He had his right hand in his pocket, gripping one of Naruto's tri-pronged kunai that Kurumu had given to him, while saying that Naruto told her to give it to Tsukune. There was only two reasons that came to Tsukune's mind when he thought about why Naruto had wanted him to have the kunai. Either it was because Naruto could teleport to it at will, or it was because the blonde wanted him to use it, and he cut his own thoughts off before they could take that rather dark path. There wasn't anyone walking through the corridors with him, as all the students were supposed to be at their classes, and it gave the area an eerily cold feeling to it. Despite the fact that he was wearing a blazer and pants, Tsukune shivered. He hadn't ever noticed it before, but now that there was no one around, Yokai Academy really did give off the same feeling that a haunted mansion gave. Before much longer, Tsukune found himself standing in front of a set of double doors. He glanced down at the map in his hands to make sure he was in the right place, before taking in a deep breath and pushing the door to his left slightly open, just enough so that he could peek inside. He'd been expecting something similar to the underground prison in Vegas, but was somewhat disappointed when he saw the stack of stairs leading downwards, dimly lit by the two light bulbs hanging from the inclined ceiling. How original, he thought sarcastically before shaking it off and making his way down the stairs. He crept down them as silently as he could manage, hoping to any and all powerful beings out there that there wasn't a yokai that had enhanced hearing at or near the bottom. Fortunately there wasn't, and he was able to release a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding in. He flipped the map that Yukari had given him around, and was greeted with a somewhat completed bird's eye view of the Public Safety Committee's headquarters. The fact that it wasn't complete didn't really matter though, it still showed the path he needed to take to reach his desired destination. He breathed in the cold and slightly repulsive air before taking a few steps forward, getting more and more confident that no one was around every time one of his feet went in front of the other, until he was briskly walking down the lone corridor that had greeted him. There were 8 doors on the left and 4 on the right, but going by Yukari's map, he needed to take the very last one on the right. The muffled sound of a wall collapsing reached his ears and he quickened his pace, his mind coming to the conclusion that the sound had been because of Naruto and Milka trying to pummel Kaio. He took a hold of the doorknob that was connected to the door at the end of the corridor. With the same grim determination he'd felt swell within him at the club room, he turned it and pushed the door open. He felt his shoulders slump in relief when he saw that there was no one in the room, and he closed the door behind him without looking back at it, something he'd soon come to realize as a big mistake. The room itself was quite small, with a width of only 3 or 4 meters, and probably double that in length. Along the walls were metal lockers, all having an assortment of locks on them, code, key, and even one that looked like it should be locking up a bike instead. At the very end, a ring with keys on it hung onto a hook which was embedded in the wall, that glinted at different intervals from the light on the ceiling. He was about to take a step towards them, but stopped when he heard a cold voice speak from behind him right where the door was located. "Hello, Tsukune-kun." If Milka had been a gambler, she'd bet that her expression would be one of surprise, and not the happy birthday, I got you this. Surprise, but the what the hell is that, and what is going on? Surprise. When Naruto had said that he was going to take the spotlight for a bit, she'd noticed a strange gleam in his eyes, as if he was up to something. It wasn't hard to guess that this was what he had been up to. Naruto was fine, in fact she'd say that he was much more than fine. A large, purple, skeletal being had surrounded him. It was tall enough that its skull nearly hit the high ceiling, and in its left hand was a purple, glowing and ethereal beam-like structure that reminded her of a sword. The sword was pointed outwards, having just sliced through Kaio's attack seemingly without much effort at all. The flames that had resulted settled down, and Kaio was visible to their eyes again, looking just as surprised, if not more so than she was. The purple being surrounding Naruto put its hand back at its side, while the sword disappeared. "It's been nearly 2 months since I last used this," Naruto muttered, his tone colder than before. 2 months. Milka's mind involuntarily wondered. 2 months ago had been before the school year started, but what situation would call for him to call on such a being? Did it have anything to do with the incident in Tokyo he'd briefly mentioned to her other half? Before she could continue her musings, Kaio began to speak, his surprise having apparently waned. "Interesting, to think that a human such as yourself would not only be able to fight yokai alone, but also be able to bring forth something like this." Kaio's eyes narrowed. "Even so, do you really think that this being will change the results?" "Who knows?" Naruto shrugged, and Milka could picture the carefree smile that was probably on his face. His voice gained that colder tone it had before. "Why don't you attack and see what happens?" It was an obvious lure and Kaio probably knew it, but he generated another set of 5 fireballs, and launched them at the blonde anyway. It happened just as it had before. Another sword came into existence in the purple being's hand and sliced horizontally, disrupting Kaio's attack, and causing an explosion at the control the compressed flames suddenly lost. This time, the purple ethereal sword didn't disappear when the flames dimmed down. Instead, the being, that looked to be under Naruto's control, gripped it tighter, bringing the blade behind itself like it was getting ready to swing. And swing it did. It sliced through the air with a loud whistle, before slamming into Kaio's side before the Yuko could even so much as yelp. The head of the Public Safety Committee was sent careening through the nearby wall, followed by the next 3. Much like the other times when the walls had been broken apart, bricks went flying around the immediate area, colliding with others before landing on the ground. Some of them had been reduced to almost nothing but ash from Kaio's flaming body, and others were still in the process of burning. Naruto began to walk forward in the direction Kaio had been sent, but before he had completely left, he turned around to glance at her, and she couldn't help but be taken aback by his eyes. No longer were they blue, they were instead the same color red her eyes were, with a strange pattern to it that she couldn't make out from the distance between them. "You just going to stay there all day?" he asked, using the words she thought when she had tried to kick Kaio to the other side of the committee's headquarters. "You finished showing off?" she found herself asking rather flatly while gesturing to the skeletal being around him. Naruto scratched the back of his head. "I wasn't trying to show off." She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, sure." Sukune froze as the cold hand rested upon his shoulder. He wasn't very familiar with the voice that the hand belonged to, but he could definitely identify who it was. Ishigami. He was still holding the map in his left hand, with his right hand in his pocket, tightly coiled around Naruto's tri-pronged kunai. "Ah, I'm glad you remember who I am," she whispered, her cold breath going along his ear and sending a shudder down his spine. "It was the club that you belonged to that put me in this situation, after all." It was either survival instinct or just him panicking, but Sukune's mind was racing, filled with possible outcomes to escape the position he found himself in, and some of them were just incoherent babble inside his head. The hand in his pocket shook slightly, and he cursed it. "You did that to yourself. Is that so?" She mused aloud, but there was an almost undetectable angry hiss in her tone. "I must ask you though, what are you doing all the way down here?" Sukune's throat felt dry, but he managed to get out a reply. "I just got lost and wandered down here." He tried and knew she didn't believe him when he heard a soft chortle. "Come now, Sukune-kun, you don't really think that I'd believe something like that, do you?" The cold hand on his shoulder moved around until it rested on the nape of his neck. "Now why are you really down here?" Sukune wasn't oblivious to the threatening tone her voice carried, as if she was silently telling him that if he didn't tell her the truth, then he'd simply be killed, or worse, be trapped forever as a stone statue. What could he do? It's not like he could actually tell her and sell everyone out. That was just out of the question, not even a possible option. "Wait a minute, why are you down here, sensei?" he asked in an attempt to buy time. The grip she had at the nape of his neck softened slightly. He didn't know why, but he wasn't complaining. "Oh, nothing much, it's just that Kaio and I have an arrangement." There was something else in her tone, bitterness, annoyance. Maybe even both, but that wasn't important. What was important was what she had said about having an arrangement with Kaio. "What do you mean?" she hummed. "Don't worry, just know that it concerns Naruto-kun and outside information." "You mean the whole thing about Kaio thinking he's a human?" "Ah." She sighed, her grip tightened once again. "It seems that I've said enough. Goodbye, Sukune-kun." Goodbye, a common word said to people who are leaving temporarily or permanently. Unfortunately, Sukune felt that it was the latter. He made a last-second decision. He began to pull Naruto's tri-pronged kunai from his pocket, but stopped when he heard a cry of pain, followed by Ishigami's hand removing itself from the nape of his neck. Sukune spun around in surprise, and was greeted to the sight of Gin standing above the prone, and apparently unconscious form of Ishigami. The werewolf ran a hand through his hair, shoulders slumping as he left his body relaxed before a sigh escaped his mouth. "You guys are really troublesome, Sukune. Senpai." He felt his eyes widen while his jaw twitched like it wanted to have a one-way vacation to the center of the earth. "Why are you here?" Gin did a pat down on his clothes, and Sukune only just noticed his rather disheveled state, as if he sprinted at light speed around the school. Okay, an exaggeration, but Gin was still pretty fast when he wanted to be nonetheless. "I'm here because I made a decision." "You mean you don't want to be a guinea pig anymore?" Gin's face wrinkled in a combination of annoyance and amusement. "Sure, let's go with that." He straightened. "Need some help, then?" For the first time since the whole situation with Kaio and the Public Safety Committee started, Sukune smiled, and it wasn't to put someone else's nerves at ease. "Yeah, that'd be appreciated." Naruto rubbed at his mildly stinging eyes. It was almost exactly like the time on the plane, and he'd watched the Saw movies, and his eyes started getting irritated from staring at the screen for too long. Only the difference was that it wouldn't go away or even simmer down. He followed the trail of destroyed walls and burning flames, Susanu's incomplete form still surrounding him. He knew that Kaio was still alive. He could still sense his strong yoki, and he knew that Susanu's sword, when it wasn't complete, wasn't used for slicing and dicing, but was used more like a baseball bat. Mocha walked by his side, looking just as confident, dignified and deadly as ever. She occasionally shot curious glances at the skeletal being around him, but stayed silent, and he didn't offer up any information. Finally, they made it to the room that Kaio had tumbled into. Said yokai had his head down, hacking up a pool of blood. The room itself was rather plain and empty. The same brick walls were present. The ceiling was still high enough to fit the Susanu's body. There was a wide open door at the other end, and it still had the dark, cold and creepy feeling to it. The corner of Naruto's lips twitched upwards. Have a nice flight. He hadn't expected Kaio to say no. It was terrible. The plane was crashing into everything, but it was still somewhat annoying when the Yuko dismissed his attempt at lightening the mood with a hateful glare. He spat out some more blood and bared his teeth at the two of them, some of the crimson liquid staining his teeth. He doesn't seem to be in a joking mood, Mocha remarked with some amusement, and Naruto smiled slightly. The current Mocha didn't usually ever show much emotion. Before Naruto could even think of a reply, the air around them started to become colder. They both looked around warily, searching for the reason until both of their eyes locked onto Kaio. The head of the Public Safety Committee was changing, and not in a good way. He was stood up on his two back legs, his body becoming slightly thinner and taller by the second. Within mere seconds, Kaio no longer had a fox-like body structure, it was more of a human's. Naruto frowned, sensing Kaio's Yuki rising to a whole new level. He's not transforming back into a human form, is he? Mocha shook her head. No, definitely not. Kaio stood as tall as he had been before releasing his true form. His ears went to the top of his skull, while flickering with blue flames. 4 tails with the same blue flames flailed around behind him. His torso was revealed to them with strange tribal-like markings on them, and his lower body was bathed in his own flames thankfully. Despite the blue fire, Naruto could still tell that his legs were the only thing that hadn't changed in his new transformation. Naruto pursed his lips. The colder temperature was unexpected, but not entirely unfamiliar. It was similar to the Amaterasu flames, so hot that it felt cold. Kaio spread his arms out wide, looking like he truly enjoyed being in the form he was currently in. You should feel honored. Not many people get to see my finely honed battle form, and those that have are all ashes in the wind. He spoke calmly and confidently, as if just him transforming for the second time guaranteed his victory. He narrowed his golden, malicious eyes. So, who wants to be the first one to die? Despite the fact that either Mocha or Naruto could potentially die, he felt excited. His heart rate had sped up, his senses were on high alert, his brain was on overdrive, and of course his blood was really pumping. That was the reason Naruto enjoyed fights like these. The excitement and the adrenaline running through his veins felt empowering, and not in the same way he felt when he was using Kurama's chakra. It was simply just his body's reaction, and he loved it. He felt a small grin tug at his lips. Come on then, Kaio. Show me what this new form of yours can do. As soon as the words left his mouth, the Susanoo materialized another ethereal blade in his hand. Beside him, Mocha tensed in preparation. Kaio raised his hand in the air, the blue flames that surrounded it following obediently. A small, almost harmless-looking ball of blue flames burst into his palm, flickering and hissing. Slowly, almost as if Kaio was purposefully waiting on suspense, he brought his hand down, his arm stretched to its full length, and the blue fireball shot forward, expanding to fill the entire width of the room in mere seconds. Naruto had a sense of deja vu as the flames barreled towards him and Mocha, but didn't dwell on it for very long. Instead, he grabbed Mocha by her arm, and pulled her inside of the skeletal being surrounding him. She grunted indignantly in a very unladylike manner, but didn't resist. The Susanoo twisted and shifted its body until its arms, sword and entire torso was covering them, gaining what Naruto would describe as its skin. Now that she was inside a clearly safe position, Mocha yanked herself away from the blonde's grasp, crossed her arms, looked away and raised her nose in the air slightly. That wasn't necessary. Naruto rolled his eyes. Oh, I'm sure it wasn't. He said sarcastically, betting that she probably knew her only other choice would have been to dodge. She looked straight ahead, glaring at the flames as if that would make them disappear. It's impressive that you're able to call on something like this. Thanks. He said offhandedly, rubbing his eyes that had been steadily becoming more and more irritated. There was a slight pause before Mocha spoke up again. How long will this last? She didn't gesture to anything, but it was fairly obvious that she meant the Susanoo. It should outlast Kaio's flames pretty easily. I only upped its defense just to be sure. Kaio's flames persisted, but Naruto's Susanoo remained unmoving and stubborn. Naruto frowned in annoyance. He could surely move towards Kaio's location with Susanoo protecting him, but how would he take the Yuko out? He couldn't even see him with all the fire in the way. Move closer, Mocha said. He couldn't place her expression, but it seemed like she had an idea, so he did as told and began to take a few steps in Kaio's general direction. The Susanoo held steadfast, unflinching even as it inched more and more into the flames. Though Naruto doubted it could actually flinch in the first place. That's when he caught on when he sensed who was getting closer. Naruto and Milka moved forwards, the Susanoo around them deflecting Kaio's flames, and making them hit the side of the walls, which had started to slowly crumble and fall apart in some areas. The growl came from the other side of the wall of bright, blue flames. Just roll over and die already. Suddenly, the flames grew in size, towering over and covering the Susanoo like a blanket. Naruto looked all around and was met with just the purple structure of his Susanoo, the blue fire around them, and Milka herself. Some of the Susanoo's skin began to melt off in some areas, but it was only on small scales, so Naruto wasn't overly worried about it. Naruto glanced at her. You think he'd have run out of steam by now? Milka merely shrugged. It doesn't really matter, she's here. As if to prove Milka's claim, a familiar, feminine, and childish voice reached their ears. Hey, you. Yeah, stupid and bad excuse for the Human Torch, over here. Naruto bit back a grin. Wow, she's letting loose on the insults, huh? Milka didn't respond verbally, but there was a small, amused smirk on her face. The flames around them died down into small embers that traced along the floor. At the opposite end of the room in the doorway, Yukari stood with a small grin on her face, while holding onto the head of a hose which looked full with water. It wasn't a small garden hose either, oh no, it was a high-pressure hose that looked like it belonged on a fire truck, rather than in an 11-year-old's hands. Kaio had moved to the side of the room in front of a wall that was still crumbling, so that he could take in all three of them in his line of sight. He looked furious as he glared at Yukari, but his shoulders were slumped slightly, and the way he stood was loose, as if Naruto could just poke him and make him fall over. So you've returned to die with these two. He narrowed his eyes at the hose. What do you think a hose can do? The Susanoo disappeared from around Naruto and Milka, while the stinging sensation behind his eyes disappeared. He gave a small grin, he knew what the hose was for, it had been part of his plan after all. Not much to worry about, Kaio. Before anyone could offer anything else up to the conversation, alarms began blaring all around the HQ, making Kaio go rigid with surprise. What have you done? Yukari's grin grew slightly bigger. It seems like Sukune-san has finished his part of the plan, letting every single one of your prisoners free to run this place to the ground. Naruto blinked. That hadn't been a part of the plan he'd supplied, but who was he to complain? Going by Kaio's expression, it was obvious that he was far from happy, and that was a good thing in Naruto's books. Despite the hose in Yukari's hands looking full, it kept slowly expanding as more and more water pumped into it. Out of time. Yukari announced, pulling back the clamp that blocked the water from being released. Water burst forth from the hose, and Kaio watched with disbelief written on his face, as the liquid blasted a nice hole in the wall right next to him. Yukari looked like she was struggling to aim it at the Yuko, and Kaio scowled, as if he'd been insulted. Even pressurized water to that degree wouldn't have a chance to take me down, you stupid witch. She kept struggling, but still managed to get out a reply. Oh, I know that already, I think everyone does, but that wasn't its purpose. When she kept struggling, Milka went over to her, having apparently decided to give the young witch a hand. It's actually probably more useful in this situation as well. Seeing as it doesn't look like we'd be able to get close to you for an extended period of time, it was Naruto's idea, but you get the gist. Decided to forcibly lower your power with the flame's natural enemy, water. Done with her small speech, Yukari let go of the hose as soon as Milka took a hold of it. Without much effort at all, Milka directed the high-pressure hose directly at Kaio, obliterating what had been left of the walls as it went. Kaio sneered. Foolish thinking. As if a hose could ever do such a thing. Despite him looking more trained than when he transformed into his current state, he apparently still had enough energy to put more power into the flames around his body, causing his entire body to light up like a real-life Human Torch, only blue. He raised his hands and the flames massed in front of him, forming a pseudo-barrier. The water slammed into flames, generating a thick mist that covered a nice area of around 5 meters squared, therefore hiding Kaio completely. Naruto smirked. It was showtime. He sprinted over to Yukari and Milka, with the latter ditching the hose to the young witch, who seemed more than glad to take it, and move out of the way to destroy some more walls. Naruto grabbed her arm and looked into her eyes. Ready. The alarms were still blaring loudly, and there was the distant sound of fighting, as well as some crazed yells. Naruto guessed that those belonged to the former prisoners. Milka nodded. Yeah. Naruto took a step forwards, gripping Milka's arm tighter with both hands. He hissed in a breath before flinging the vampire forwards, directly at the mist which surrounded Kaio. Milka twisted her body so that she was barreling in feet first. She punched a hole through the mist like rocket. Naruto caught the expression of shock that had shown on Kaio's revealed face, only to see the Yuko disappear when he was formally introduced to the bottom of Milka's shoes. Naruto watched with smug satisfaction as Kaio's face distorted, before it was followed by several loud cracking sounds like bones breaking, which was probably the case. The next second, Milka and Kaio had disappeared, rather loud booms being the only indication that they were still in motion and slamming through walls. Naruto turned around to Yukari and saw that the young witch had apparently stopped destroying things with water. The clamp on the hose was back down, but the hose itself looked empty, as if someone had stopped pumping water into it. Run out. She pouted. Yeah, apparently that big-chested cow decided to turn it off. Too. Kurumu. Ah. His lips twitched upwards slightly at her nickname for the succubus. Where is she anyway? Yukari blinked at him, and placed the hose down in the inch-deep water she was standing in. On top of the tallest building at this academy, it's where the hose was. Naruto opened his mouth to say how stupid it was to have a hose on a roof, but decided against it, and just shook his head instead. Alright, whatever, I'm going to Mocha-chan. Finding Mocha wasn't hard, he just had to follow the trail of destroyed walls and blue flames. When he came to the last destroyed wall, he found Mocha leaning against a locker with her arms crossed, apparently waiting for him. She was standing in an admittedly small room. It was only 3 or 4 meters wide, and the length of it was around double that. Exact replicas of the locker that Mocha was leaning on coated the walls with various locks on them. Kaio, on the other hand, didn't look to be in very good condition. He was slumped on a bent-in locker, his blue flames flickering hopelessly, and looking more harmless than malicious. He opened his mouth in a snarl as a way of greeting him, but he coughed and hacked up some blood onto the floor beside him. Naruto smiled. It looks like you're barely holding on to consciousness, Kaio. Kaio managed to snarl this time. I'll get stronger, he promised. And when I do, I'll kill everyone you've ever shown any affection towards. Naruto took a couple of steps, so he was standing in front of the downed Yuko. Really? He asked, bending down to glare straight into Kaio's golden eyes. You can try I suppose, but that doesn't really matter right now. What does is how you found out that I'm a human. Ishigami. Naruto blinked. Wow, that was easy. I didn't expect you to rat her out so easily. Kaio sneered. Why shouldn't I? I don't have any loyalty to her, and finding out that she might be killed brings me joy. Good point. Naruto amended before standing back up and sighing. He looked back down into Kaio's hateful eyes. It's fine if you plan on coming after me again in the future, but I guess you should at least know what you're up against. The warmth slowly started to spread through his body, and he soon found himself looking at a shocked Kaio, his body having gained a golden glow and a tattered cloak Kurama's chakra. I don't want to see you again until you think you can fight me full on Kaio, because the next time I won't hold back. Another golden ember broke off from his cloak, and that was the last one Naruto saw before he felt Kurama's chakra leave him. Kaio's head had slumped down, apparently unconscious. What was it just now? Mocha asked, and he turned around to see her looking genuinely surprised and interested. Maybe I'll tell you sometime. Naruto shrugged with what he hoped was a dismissive smile. But now we need to go get Sukune as well as Gin. Freeing a bunch of crazy yokai from imprisonment can have been enjoyable. Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed. If you want a next part of this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. And also check out the other videos that I have created and enjoy. See you in the next video. Peace.